Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a Monday morning, and I'd like to say that I had lots of good news for you on a Monday morning, but I'm afraid I don't, because, well, it's the news, and let's be honest, the news is very rarely positive. But before we get on to the main news of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, and if you'd like to support the work that I do here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. So let's get into the main news stories. And the first news story is, well, economic, because news has come out that Ford SA wishes to retrench 470 workers. There's 391 operator roles in Pretoria and 73 positions in Gqeberha, also known as Port Elizabeth. Now, they were also getting rid of 10 administrative roles. So this equates to 10% of both the Pretoria and the Port Elizabeth staff roles. That's 10% each, not 10% total. This comes despite Ford investing $1 billion or 15.8 billion rand in 2021. Now, the investment was to expand Ranger production, the largest in its history. Now, the expansion raised plant capacity from 168 to 200,000 vehicles annually, geared to exports. But unfortunately, it hasn't actually worked out for them, because in typical fashion, it very rarely does. Now, Solidarity warns that job losses could cascade. Now, Ford directly employs 5,284 staff in South Africa. And the knock-on effect is that every auto assembly job supports roughly around 7 downstream jobs, that's suppliers, logistics, and dealerships, meaning that whilst it's 470 workers just at Ford, there's around 300 plus jobs indirectly at risk. Now, Pretoria and Port Elizabeth communities will see major strain, especially where unemployment already exceeds the 40% expanded rate. Now, for those of you who don't know, Mercedes cut 700 jobs at East London in 2024, and BMW and others are currently complaining of cheap imports eroding domestic sales and call for stronger state protections. To be clear, what they're actually referring to is the cheap Chinese cars that are flooding the market. Now, the US tariffs on South Africa auto exports also caused an 82% drop in shipments to the US in the first half of 2025, as compared to 2024. And so trade unions fear industry retrenchment becoming unavoidable if demand continues to weaken. And to be honest, I think that's exactly what we're going to see. Because in other news, the new CEO, Simon Trott, is restructuring his Richards Bay minerals mine. He intends to instead restructure the business to focus only on iron ore, aluminium, lithium, and copper. Now, this ultimately meant that Richards Bay Minerals has been classified as non-core and now is under review for sale, closure, or downscaling. Now, for context, Richards Bay Minerals employs over 5,000 workers and spends around 1 billion rand a month. They're the largest taxpayer in KwaZulu-Natal. Now, they also run the Southern Hemisphere's largest titanium smelter. You see, the problem here is that they're saying that Richards Bay is just, well, not that important to them anymore. But they themselves are very important to Richards Bay and KZN as a whole. So why exactly are they taking this move? Well, in 2021, their general manager, Nico Swart, was assassinated en route to work, and this was linked to a procurement dispute. They've had repeated violence, petrol bombings, equipment arson, and over the last 9 months, they've had force majeure shutdowns. Now, they had planned an expansion to extend the mine's life by 25 years, but this has still not been approved due to, well, government ineptness. So, what's the implications? Well, they may downscale or they may just close the mine, and this will lead to a loss of billions in tax revenue for KZN, making KZN a ghost town. I mean, the ANC loves to make ghost towns. They're actually very good at it. So thousands of jobs are at risk, and the ripple effects on Richards Bay and the national mining supply chains are, well, going to be catastrophic. Now, Simon Trott does say that he promises disciplined capital allocation, but everybody knows that what that actually means is that he's going to look at the business and say, where should I put my money? It's not in South Africa, move it elsewhere. So, by rights, workers fear mass retrenchments, and to be honest, they should. Now, this also comes on the news that South Africa's biggest steel producer is moving ahead with its plans to shut down its long steel operations. The company had set a deadline for the 30th of September to wind down. Now, they had been in discussion with the government in order to save the plant because it's the only one left. And it's really, really important, especially if the government wants to do this whole industrialization program that they keep talking about. Now, the move will see over 3,000 jobs in Newcastle and the Vaal, lost. So yet again, government is really, really good at creating ghost towns. I mean, like, really good. Now, talking of government plans to make ghost towns, the latest one is clearly going to be the implementation of the Employment Equity Amendment Act. Now, Sogelika and NEMSA had taken the actual sectoral targets due to come in on the 1st of September to the Gauteng High Court in order to get those suspended whilst the actual act is reviewed. Now, according to the judge at said High Court, he denied the urgent interdict on the basis that the horse has bolted. He said that the minister has lawfully exercised their powers in April 2025, and the court says businesses should instead pursue a judicial review matter of the regulations, and that he was powerless to stop the actual sectoral targets being implemented. Now, for those of you who don't know, non-compliance with the sectoral targets means that most companies could face up to 2.7 million rands in fines or 10% of turnover in fines, with the additional risk of losing employment equity compliance certificates, which are essential for government tenders worth billions annually. Now, employers could escape the penalties only with reasonable grounds for missing targets, and let's be honest, you're still going to have to show how you're in the long term going to have to meet the targets. Now, business groups have responded, saying that apparently this ruling was fraught with errors, and they had suggested that they planned to directly appeal to the Constitutional Court. Now, Sogelika has called the judgment deeply flawed and says that employment equity quotas are ideological experiments that endanger businesses. And let's be honest, we've just talked about all the businesses shutting because of ANC policy. Now, Sogelika argues that the employment equity targets are essentially state-based race and gender quotas, which threaten economic growth. And to be honest, anybody who's not an ANC cadre, yet you pretty much see this as being the reality. In any case, many of these business groups say that they are prepared for a multi-year legal campaign to reverse or water down employment equity laws. And to be frank, we're all at that position where BEE should be done away with. Let's be honest, Ramaphosa himself was one of the first beneficiaries of BEE, and these, ladies and gentlemen, were all the companies that awarded him all their BEE statuses in order to basically get some kind of link into the government. So these are all the companies that are responsible for the current BEE state capture. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. You cannot expect turkeys to vote against Christmas. They are not going to side in it for the common good. Because let's be honest, they are benefiting from it. So it is not in their best interest to get rid of it. Now, talking of Sogelika has joined the case of solidarity, the HFA and the BHF against the National Health Insurance Act. Now, the Pretoria High Court had already struck down sections 36 to 40 of the NHI Act, specifically the Certificate of Needs rules, saying that they unlawfully restrict doctors' rights to practice, but other parts still stand. But many of them are actually under attack for being vague, unconstitutional, and unaffordable. Because let's be honest, the whole point of the NHI was that it was vague, that it was unconstitutional, and that it was unaffordable. Because the ANC never actually did the hard work to say what are the specifics, because they didn't want to alert, the private industry, and they didn't want to transgress the Constitution, because they knew that they would, and they didn't really want to talk about the affordability of it, because they knew they didn't have the money. Now, conservative estimates put the NHI at 500 billion annually, equivalent to a 30% income tax increase. This is not going to happen. We all saw what happened with the VAT increase and how that all turned into a national riot. Now, in terms of the current budget, South Africa's tax revenue is only 2.1 trillion rand. So the NHI would eat nearly a quarter of all state revenue, which is just stupid for a country like ours. By comparison, health already consumes 260 billion, so the NHI would effectively double this, well, instantly. The state already pays 1 billion rand a day in debt interest alone, which means that NHI could worsen our fiscal crisis. And with all the businesses leaving South Africa, I'm not really sure whether they get any tax to fund the bloody thing. So Solidarity warns that doctors will ultimately immigrate amidst a collapsing healthcare system. In other words, many of these doctors aren't just going to sit around and go, well, we've now seen the government collapse our sector. We'll just work in a collapsed sector. No, they'll seek better opportunities abroad, which is why the BHF has suggested that 9.7 million private scheme members will effectively lose cover, which in itself would violate their constitutional rights to healthcare underneath Section 27 of the Constitution. Now, the medical funders warn of service regression and mass doctors' exodus and over-centralization of power in the Department of Health. And let's be honest, over-centralizing any power in the government's hands is a mistake because the government are retarded. Now, Sarkodika says that the NHI is a colossal waste of resource and a threat to jobs, business, and patients. And to that, I would say, guys, since when does the government care about jobs, business, or patients? They care about a big fund that they can loot. We all know this to be true. And let's be honest, there is no bigger fund to loot than the NHI. Now, the health minister, moron, says that the NHI will be implemented whether people like it or not. Because he's just not a very smart individual who cares about you or me. Now, the government argues that the current system is elitist and unsustainable, says the billionaires in government who all fly abroad for private healthcare on the taxpayer's dime, says all the state-captured elites that have leached off the state coffers for decades. Yep, the system's elite. Yep, you guys don't live in luxury. Yeah, we hear you. Like, the gall of these people is just beyond belief. According to the government, the NHI is the only way to achieve universal healthcare by 2030. And I'm reminded that we have universal healthcare right now. It's called the public healthcare sector. It's just not very good because the government wastes the money. Tembisa is a great example of goods being sold to the public sector at like triple the cost because it's a good tender program. Like, let's not lie to the public. We have universal healthcare, and the problems of overcharging and looting state funds is not suddenly going to just disappear when you have a centralized fund. In fact, it's going to intensify. So critics counter that the NHI will destroy what works whilst failing to fix what doesn't, and that's 100% correct. So, moving then on, and that is the Trump's economic pressures on South Africa. And this is obviously the news that the US tariffs up to 30% have hit South Africa's exports in citrus and the automobiles. Now, you may look at that and say, well, the US only buys 8% of South African exports, with the EU and China each equating to about 20% when you add them together. Now, precious metals, which include gold, platinum, and palladium, are exempt from the tariffs, which have cushioned the blow of what the tariffs might mean to South Africa. But what we've still seen, according to Melville Douglas, which is an analyst, well, GDP has been impacted with a 0.2% loss on current GDP. So we're no longer in the growth phase of South Africa. Remember, the growth was projected at 0.8%. Well, we're now officially in a recession. But there is a bigger threat on the horizon. So we've been talking about tariffs for a while, but tariffs aren't actually our biggest problem. The biggest problem is actually what's now being termed the bond ban. And this is the news that the US investors hold up to 20% of Rand-dominated government bonds and the majority of foreign currency South African bonds. So yes, the US actually owns quite a lot of South Africa. And if Trump bans US investors from buying South African debt, local banks and insurers must absorb an additional 20% of government debt. And to be honest, they can't. They will go bust. Now, this risks the banking sector overload and financial instability because, as you know, South African debt is currently at 76% of GDP and rising, with states spending over 1 billion a day on debt interest alone, which is the fastest growing budget line. Now, whilst China has already tried to diversify away from US trade, With US shares of Chinese exports having halved since Trump's first term, the global trade rerouting is currently proving problematic, which ultimately means that China's economy itself may slow down. Now, South Africa's commodity exports could collapse if that occurs, which would weaken the rand and would spark inflation. Now, the Reserve Bank has already cut the repo rate by 1.25%, and inflation is near 3%, so we do have a temporary cushion. But the reality is that we have three potential risks from the Trump administration. The first being the tariffs, the second is the bond ban, and the third is, well, what happens to the Chinese economy if that starts to slow down? So things are not looking very good from that front. And turning then onto the last news article today, and that is, according to the Chandler Good Governance Index, the CGGI, of 2025, South Africa has ranked last, yes, last, out of all 120 countries surveyed for crime and unemployment. Our overall rank fell from 70th in 2021 to 68th in 2022 to 77 in 2025. Now, by comparison, we've been outperformed by Mauritius, Rwanda, Botswana, and Morocco. Because, as you know, our official unemployment rate is currently 33.2%. That's 1 in 3 people. And expanded unemployment is, 42.9%, which includes discouraged job workers. And youth unemployment, that's youths between the ages of 15 and 34, at over 60%. Now, the actual index defines safety as the state's ability to protect its citizens. And South Africa has one of the highest murder rates, that's 45 over 100,000 people, in the world. And the violent crime epidemic undermines investor confidence and social stability, which means that we have a dual effect. Unemployment continues to rise because, crime continues to rise. Other problems with South Africa also include the healthcare and income inequality, which has both scored near the bottom globally. And the helping people rise category, we're at 113 out of 120, so 7 away from the bottom. Now, helping people rise is effectively, what are we doing to get people out of poverty? And according to the index, nothing. Now, unfortunately, all of this is due to government's failures, which have all been blamed on corruption, policy uncertainty, and a lack of reform. Remember that Ramaphosa was meant to be the great reformer, but so far the only thing he's reformed is the economy in order to make it uninvestable, unattractive, and highly unemployed. Yes, he has certainly de-industrialized South Africa. In any case, these are all the news stories of today. Let me know what you think of them all in the comment section below. Doom and gloom, I know it sounds that way, but to be frank, there's doom and gloom everywhere at the moment. Nothing globally looks up or positive, regardless of where you are. In any case, that's just my views. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.